September-December 1945, Camp Ruston, Louisiana. September 1945. The war in Europe had ended 4 months earlier, but for 4,000 German prisoners of war held in the pine forests of northern Louisiana, surrender had brought an unexpected gift: survival. From the watchtower, the camp stretched like a small city, rows of barracks painted white, a chapel, a theater, sports fields, an infirmary with real doctors. And at the center, something almost impossible to believe, an orchestra rehearsing Beethoven's Symphony No. 9. This was not the Germany they had left behind. Johann Reimer, 23 years old, former Wehrmacht corporal, stood before a makeshift blackboard, teaching English to a group of prisoners. Freedom, he wrote in chalk. Liberty, democracy. Words that now seemed less like propaganda and more like possibilities. Around him, men who had fought under Hitler's flag now studied American history, read translated newspapers, and debated the future of a country that no longer existed. In Barrack 7, Otto Drexler folded his work uniform carefully. Every morning at 6, he boarded a truck that took him to Ruth Collins's farm, 15 miles from camp. There, he planted cotton, repaired fences, and learned that American soil felt no different beneath his hands than German soil. Ruth, a widow with 2 young sons, treated him not as an enemy but as a worker, sometimes as a friend. "Otto," she would say, handing him lemonade at noon, "you're too young to have seen what you've seen." He never knew how to respond. Inside the camp's cultural center, Gerhard Falk adjusted his violin. A former music teacher from Dresden, he now led an orchestra of 30 prisoners. They performed Mozart, Brahms, and Schubert for American guards who stood at attention, forgetting for a moment that these were the men they had been trained to kill. Music dissolved borders that barbed wire could not. Major William Carter walked through the camp every evening. A career officer, disciplined and distant, he nonetheless understood something the Pentagon did not. These men were no longer soldiers. They were survivors of the apocalypse trying to rebuild meaning from the ruins of ideology. He watched them play soccer, attended their theatrical performances, read their internal newspapers printed on salvaged paper, and he asked himself a question he could not answer. What would happen when Washington ordered them home? Because home no longer existed. Dresden was ash, Hamburg was rubble, Berlin was divided. And the men in Camp Ruston knew this through letters that arrived irregularly, written in shaking hands by mothers, sisters, and wives who begged, "Don't come back. There is nothing here, only hunger and ghosts." Yet, despite everything, there was laughter in Camp Ruston. There were friendships formed between guards and prisoners. There were English classes and agricultural training programs. There was the strange, fragile hope that perhaps the war's end was not an ending but a threshold. On Christmas Eve 1945, the chapel filled beyond capacity. Padre Elijah Brooks, an African-American chaplain who had seen his own share of injustice, led a service in broken German. The prisoners sang Silent Night in their native tongue. The guards stood outside, listening. No one knew yet that in 6 weeks everything would collapse. No one knew that survival could become its own form of punishment. But for now, in this temporary city of wooden walls and impossible hope, men who had been enemies discovered they could be human again. And that discovery would soon demand a terrible price. January 1946, January 14th, 1946. Major William Carter stood alone in his office, holding a telegram that weighed more than any weapon he had carried during the war. Department of War, Directive 328B. All German POWs to be repatriated immediately, no exceptions. Deportation begins March 1946. He read it 3 times, as if repetition might change the words. Outside his window, Johann taught his English class. Otto prepared for another day at Ruth Collins's farm. The orchestra rehearsed Vivaldi's Spring. Ironic, considering winter was about to arrive in the cruelest form possible. Carter knew what awaited these men in Germany. The reports crossed his desk weekly. Cities without roofs, children without parents, a population surviving on 900 calories per day. The occupation zones had become open-air prisons where former soldiers were viewed with suspicion by both conquerors and civilians. He delayed the announcement for 3 days. On January 17th, he finally called an assembly in the main refectory. 4,000 men gathered, their faces showing the comfortable routine of camp life. Some carried books, others wore aprons from kitchen duty. The orchestra members still held their instruments. Carter stepped to the microphone. His voice, normally firm, cracked slightly. "Gentlemen, I have received orders from Washington." The room stilled instantly. "All prisoners of war are to be repatriated to Germany. Deportation will begin in 6 weeks. There are no exceptions. There will be no extensions." Silence. Not the silence of acceptance, but the silence of a world collapsing inward. Then Gerhard Falk stood, the violin teacher from Dresden, who had lost his entire family in the firebombing, looked directly at Carter with eyes that held no anger, only devastating clarity. "Major," he said quietly, "there is no Germany for us to return to." The words hung in the air like smoke. Otto Drexler felt his chest tighten. He thought of Ruth's farm, the cotton fields that would soon need planting, the small room in her barn where she had promised he could stay, as long as necessary. He thought of her youngest son, who called him Mr. Otto and asked him to teach German words. Johann's hands trembled, crumpling the English grammar book he had been studying. All those lessons, all those words about freedom and democracy. What did they mean if liberty was simply the right to die slowly in rubble? Around the refectory, men began to understand. This was not liberation. This was exile to a graveyard. Sergeant Mike Torres, a guard who had befriended several prisoners, turned to his colleague and whispered, "Jesus Christ, we're sending them to their deaths." Carter stood at the podium, watching the men's faces transform from shock to something more dangerous, realization. The kind that precedes either surrender or rebellion. "Dismissed," he said, though no one moved. As the prisoners filed out in silence, Gerhard approached the major one last time. "Sir," he said, "if freedom means returning to hell, then we were freer as your prisoners." Carter had no answer because Gerhard was right. And in 6 weeks, the first transport would leave for the port of New Orleans, carrying men who had survived Hitler's war only to face a peace that offered no mercy. Late January, early February 1946, the announcement changed everything overnight. Camp Ruston, which had hummed with the rhythm of routine and cautious hope, now pulsed with quiet desperation. Johann Reimer stopped teaching English. Instead, he began writing. Petition after petition, addressed to the Department of War, the International Red Cross, and Louisiana Governor Jimmy Davis. His handwriting, normally precise, grew increasingly urgent across the pages. "We request humanitarian consideration for voluntary resettlement. Germany cannot sustain its returning soldiers. We have skills valuable to American agriculture and industry. We ask not for mercy, but for logic." He collected signatures. 300 names in the first week alone. Meanwhile, the camp's work details began to dissolve. Men who had volunteered enthusiastically for farm labor now moved slowly, deliberately, not refusing outright. That would trigger punishment, but reducing productivity to a whisper of what it had been. The guards noticed immediately. "They're not defying orders," Sergeant Torres reported to Carter. "They're just fading. Like they've already started dying." Outside the fences, something unexpected was happening. Ruth Collins stood in her kitchen, staring at the fields Otto would have planted next month. Without him, she would lose half her crop. But that wasn't what made her hands shake as she picked up the telephone. "Martha, it's Ruth. We need to talk about the Germans." Within days, 12 farm owners met in the back room of Ruston's only diner. They drafted a letter to their congressman. "These men are not our enemies. They are our workers, our neighbors. Sending them to starve in Germany serves no one's interest, not theirs, not ours, not America's." The letter was signed by men who had lost sons at Normandy. Inside Camp Ruston, the orchestra took on new meaning. Every evening at 6, Gerhard assembled his musicians in the central courtyard. They played Schubert's Death and the Maiden. They played Mahler's Elegies, music that acknowledged what words could not. American guards stood listening. Many with tears they pretended were from the cold. Padre Elijah Brooks became the unlikely mediator. As an African-American chaplain who understood systemic injustice, he moved between the prisoners and Major Carter, carrying messages that official channels refused. Major Oni said one evening, "These men are organizing something, not violence, and they're too smart for that. But they won't go quietly." Carter stared at the reports on his desk. Productivity down 40%, 0 disciplinary incidents, a silence more powerful than any riot. What do they want, Padre? The same thing every human wants: a chance to live. On February 3rd, Otto returned from Ruth's farm carrying something he'd never brought before, a letter written in her handwriting, addressed to the governor. She cried when she wrote it, Otto told Johann. She said, "If they take me, they take her hope that this war meant something." That night, in Barrack 7, 50 men gathered around Johann as he read aloud from the American Declaration of Independence he'd studied so carefully. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Someone laughed bitterly. Someone else wept. Gerhard stood and spoke the words that would become their rallying cry. "In Ruston, we learned we are not just Germans. We are human beings, and human beings do not walk willingly into graves." The rebellion was no longer a possibility. It was inevitable. Mid-February 1946, February 12th, 1946. Dawn broke over Camp Ruston to find the refectory completely empty. Not a single prisoner had come for breakfast. Sergeant Torres walked through the rows of untouched trays, scrambled eggs growing cold, coffee still steaming, and felt his stomach drop. He had seen combat in France. He knew what silence before action felt like. In the barracks, 300 men sat on their bunks, not speaking, not moving, simply refusing. The Great Strike had begun. Johann Reimer had organized it with the precision of a military campaign. No violence, no destruction of property, no verbal confrontations, just the absolute withdrawal of cooperation. They would not eat, they would not work, they would not participate in their own deportation. Major Carter received the report at 0700 hours. By 0800, he was walking through the barracks, seeing what his guards had described. Men sitting in perfect stillness, eyes forward, committed to a resistance more powerful than any weapon. "This is insubordination," Carter said. Though his voice lacked conviction, Gerhard Falk, now the unofficial spokesman, stood slowly. "Major, with respect, we are already condemned. Insubordination requires a future worth protecting. We have none." Outside the fences, news spread through Ruston like wildfire. Ruth Collins was the first to act. She drove to every farm within 20 miles, collecting signatures for a petition to the Louisiana state legislature. By noon, she had 43 names. By evening, 78. "These men built our barns, harvested our crops, sat at our tables," she told the editor of the Ruston Daily Leader. "How can we call ourselves Christians if we send them to die?" The newspaper, to everyone's surprise, published her letter on the front page. "Local farmers defend German prisoners. They are our neighbors now." In Washington, the telegram from Camp Ruston landed on desks already overwhelmed by post-war logistics. A hunger strike by POWs was inconvenient, embarrassing, but ultimately irrelevant. The deportation schedule would not change. Back in Ruston, the strike entered its third day. Medical officers reported dangerous weight loss. Some men were drinking only water. Others had stopped drinking entirely. The guards grew increasingly uncomfortable. Many had formed friendships with prisoners during the 18 months they'd served together. Now they watched men they'd played cards with slowly weakening, and orders required them to do nothing. "This doesn't feel right, sir," Torres told Carter. "These aren't enemy combatants anymore. They're just people." Carter knew. God, how he knew. On February 15th, Padre Brooks organized an unprecedented meeting in the camp chapel. Guards and prisoners together, though technically against regulations. He read from Exodus, "Let my people go." The irony was not lost on anyone. Otto Drexler, weaker than the others because he had always been thin, wrote a letter to Ruth that he knew might never be sent. "You showed me that not all borders are made of wire, some are made of kindness. I will carry your family's faces with me, wherever they send us, even if it is to our graves." By day 5, the strike had become a phenomenon. Radio stations across Louisiana picked up the story. Ministers preached about it. Veterans groups debated it in American Legion halls. And in Camp Ruston, 300 men sat in their barracks, growing weaker by the hour, committed to the only protest left to them, the refusal to cooperate with their own destruction. Major Carter stood in his office, staring at the orders from Washington that had just arrived. Use force if necessary. Forced feeding authorized deportation proceeds as scheduled. He closed his eyes. The war, it seemed, would never truly end. Late February, March 1946. February 23rd. The medical tent had become a battlefield of a different kind. Army doctors arrived with feeding tubes and restraints. Orders were orders. The hunger strike had entered its 11th day, and Washington demanded action. Forced nutrition, they called it. The prisoners had another name, violation. Johann Reimer was among the first taken. 2 guards, men who had laughed with him during English lessons, held his arms while a tube was inserted through his nose. He did not resist. He did not need to. His eyes said everything. "I'm sorry," whispered one of the guards. Johann could not respond. But later, back in his barrack, he would write, "They can force food into our bodies, but they cannot force acceptance into our souls." Major Carter watched from a distance, his uniform suddenly feeling like a costume. He had commanded men in combat. He had made decisions that cost lives to save others. But this, forcing life into men who saw death as preferable to their destination, this was something else entirely. That evening, Carter received another order: isolate the leaders. Johannes Gerhardt and 7 others were moved to solitary barracks, separated from the general population. The military logic was simple: remove the organizers, collapse the resistance. It had the opposite effect. The remaining prisoners doubled their commitment. If their leaders could be isolated, then leadership would become collective. Every man became a spokesman. Every silence became a statement. Padre Elijah Brooks requested an emergency meeting with Carter. "Major, they are not fighting against you. They are fighting against fate itself. Can you not see the difference?" "I see men refusing lawful orders, Padre." Lawful. Brooks let the word hang between them. The slave codes were lawful once. Lawful and just are not always the same thing. Carter had no response. Outside the camp, Ruth Collins made a desperate decision. She drove 6 hours to Baton Rouge, walked into the state capitol, and demanded to see the governor. When denied, she sat in the lobby with a sign reading, "Louisiana farmers stand with Camp Ruston." She sat for 3 days. On the 3rd day, a legislative aide finally brought her a message. "The governor appreciates your concern, but federal deportation orders supersede state authority." Ruth drove home in silence, knowing she had failed. On March 1st, the prisoners gathered in the central courtyard for what they knew would be their last act of collective defiance. The orchestra, weakened but unbroken, assembled with their instruments. Gerhardt raised his bow. They played "Swing Low, Sweet Chariot," a spiritual they had learned from Padre Brooks, a song about deliverance that had sustained slaves who understood about impossible journeys and cruel destinations. The guards stood at attention, many openly weeping. As the final notes faded into the Louisiana evening, Gerhardt turned to face Major Carter, who had emerged from his office. "Major," Gerhardt said, his voice barely above a whisper, "the law can be perfectly legal and still profoundly wrong. History will remember which side you stood on." Carter looked at this man, this enemy soldier turned musician turned rebel, and saw himself reflected in the judgment. "History," Carter replied quietly, "rarely remembers men like us at all." The deportation trains were scheduled to arrive in 72 hours. April 1946. April 3rd, 1946. Dawn arrived cold and merciless over Camp Ruston. The trucks came at 0600 hours, their engines breaking the silence like a pronouncement of death. Olive green military transports lined up outside the main gate, exhaust rising in the morning air like industrial breath. Inside the barracks, men dressed slowly. Some had been awake all night. Others had slept the heavy sleep of the defeated. Johann folded his English dictionary carefully, the one Padre Brooks had given him, and placed it in his small canvas bag. It weighed almost nothing. It meant everything. Otto Drexler stood at the window, watching the sun rise over fields he would never plant. He thought of Ruth's farm, the smell of fresh-turned soil, the way her youngest son had hugged him goodbye yesterday with the innocent ferocity of children who don't understand permanence. The guards moved through the barracks with faces of stone, but their eyes betrayed them. Sergeant Torres stopped at Johann's bunk. "I wrote to my congressman," he said quietly. "For whatever that's worth. It's worth knowing someone tried," Johann replied. "Just, that's more than most prisoners of war can say." At the main gate, Ruth Collins stood behind the fence line, her hands gripping the chain link until her knuckles turned white. She had driven through the night to be here, though regulations prohibited civilian contact during deportation procedures. When Otto emerged from the barracks, she called his name. The guards, in a moment of unauthorized mercy, let him approach. "Mrs. Collins, don't." Her voice cracked. "Don't say goodbye like this means something noble. They're murdering you with paperwork and calling it policy." Otto reached through the fence and touched her hand briefly. "You gave me something I thought the war had taken forever," he said. "You reminded me I was still human." A whistle blew. Prisoners were ordered to form lines. The loading began with brutal efficiency. 50 men per truck, names checked against manifests. Each prisoner received a Red Cross package: sardines, crackers, chocolate, rations for a journey to nowhere. Gerhard Falk climbed into the truck bed last, violin case clutched against his chest. He looked back at Camp Ruston, the chapel, the theatre, the courtyard where his orchestra had played, and understood with terrible clarity that this had been the last home he would ever know. As the trucks prepared to depart, something unexpected happened. The American guards, 200 men in uniform, spontaneously came to attention and saluted. Not the enemy, the humans they were losing. Major Carter stood at the gate, hand at his temple, watching men he had been ordered to protect now being sent to their probable destruction. Tears ran down his face unchecked. The trucks rolled forward. From inside one vehicle, voices began to sing. Not in German, but in the English they had learned so carefully. "Amazing Grace. How sweet the sound." Other trucks joined, 400 voices singing a hymn about souls being saved while being transported to damnation. Ruth Collins collapsed against the fence, sobbing. Padre Brooks stood beside her, his own face wet, and whispered the only prayer that made sense. "Forgive us. God forgive us all." The convoy disappeared down the dirt road, dust rising like a funeral shroud. Camp Ruston stood empty, and America, victorious in war, had just committed a crime of peace that no tribunal would ever judge. Hamburg, Germany. Winter, 1947. Gerhard Falk died on February 14th, in a city that had become a monument to destruction. The firebombing had left Hamburg a skeleton of itself. Buildings without roofs, streets without names, people without futures. He had survived the war, survived imprisonment, survived the hunger strike, but he could not survive the peace. Tuberculosis, contracted in an unheated refugee shelter, took him in 3 months. His violin, the one he had carried from Louisiana, was sold for bread by strangers who found his body. No one knows what happened to it after that. His final letter, discovered among his possessions, was addressed to Major Carter. "You were a good man, trapped in a bad order. I forgive you. I hope someday you forgive yourself." Carter never received it, but he would carry the guilt until his own death in 1979. New York Harbor, May 1952. Johann Reimer stepped off a ship for the second time in his life, this time legally. An immigration visa, sponsored by a Lutheran church organization, had finally granted him what the war could not, the right to choose his own fate. He had survived the hunger years in Germany by teaching English to children of occupation officers. Irony had become his constant companion. In 1955, he traveled to Ruston. The camp was gone, already being reclaimed by pine forest, but he found Padre Brooks, now elderly, still serving at the same church. They stood together where the barracks had been. "I never forgot you," Brooks said. "Any of you." "We never forgot that someone cared," Johann replied. In a world designed for our erasure, you saw us as human. That's not a small thing, Padre, that's everything. Johann lived until 1981, teaching German literature at a small college in Minnesota. He never married. When asked why, he would say, "I left my capacity for building futures in a camp in Louisiana." Ruston, Louisiana, 1953. Otto Drexler returned on a summer morning that smelled of cotton and possibility. Ruth Collins stood on her porch and wept when she saw him walking up the dirt road, thinner than before but alive. "I told you I'd come back," he said simply. He worked her farm for 23 years, never as a prisoner, as family. Ruth's sons called him Uncle Otto. The community, which had fought so hard to keep him, welcomed him as one of their own. He died in 1976, buried in Ruston Cemetery, under a headstone that reads, Otto Drexler, friend, farmer, survivor. Camp Ruston, 1982. A small historical marker was finally erected where the camp once stood. It mentions the prisoners, the work programs, the cultural activities. It does not mention the rebellion. It does not mention the hunger strike. It does not mention that America, in the name of law and order, sent men to probable death despite pleas from its own citizens. Some histories are too uncomfortable to commemorate, but the echoes remain. In church records, in farm deeds, in letters preserved by families who never forgot, in the memory of a community that tried, however imperfectly, to choose compassion over policy. The rebellion of Camp Ruston never became a headline. It didn't fit the narratives either nation wanted to tell, but its truth endures, that even in war's aftermath, humans can choose dignity over obedience, that freedom without safety is exile by another name, and that sometimes the greatest prisons are not the ones we're held in, but the ones we're forced to return to. The war ended in 1945. For the men of Camp Ruston, it never ended at all.